They silenced her tongue but forgot that truth finds its voice, even in death. In the heart of a forgotten village, nestled between whispering forests and restless rivers, there lived a girl whose voice was stolen before it ever had the chance to bloom. The elders say she cried once as a baby, and never again. No laugh, no scream, no whisper ever crossed her lips after that first wail. They called her cursed. Some said a spirit stole her breath. Others whispered that her silence was punishment for a sin she hadn't even committed. Whatever the reason, her muteness became legend, woven into the village's superstitions like thread into cloth. She grew in the shadows of her people, her eyes speaking the pain her mouth could not. Children would laugh and mimic her gestures. Women would shoo her away like a stray dog. Men kept their distance, unnerved by her stillness. And the elders, they watched her with a fear they never admitted aloud. They feared her not for what she could say, but for what she might know. Because in the quiet corners of the earth, it is often the silent who hear the most. There was something unspoken between her and the land. Birds never scattered when she walked near. The wind always shifted when she stood still. It was as though the earth itself leaned closer to hear the words she could not utter. Yet even as nature listened, the villagers remained deaf, willingly blind to the mystery in their midst. For to see her as more than cursed would be to admit that they had done something terrible. She was a symbol of their guilt. A living reminder of a past no one wanted to confront. The villagers called her a wheel. She had no friends, no allies. Not even the old women who whispered charms under their breath would let her near their huts. Her mother, once a proud beauty of the clan, had long since disappeared into the forest, some say driven mad by shame. Her father? A man whose name no one dared mention, whose bloodline was erased from the oral records. That left a wheel alone, surrounded by people who watched her like a ticking clock they didn't know how to stop. As the years passed, her silence grew heavier, like a storm cloud too full to hold itself. And while they kept her at a distance, a wheel saw everything. Secrets exchanged in shadow, rituals performed behind locked doors, lies traded like coin in the marketplace. She watched, learned, and remembered. For what else could she do, but become a vessel for the truth no one wanted spoken? But the thing about silence is that it doesn't last forever. One night, as the moon hung low and red in the sky, the village gathered. It was punishment night, a cruel tradition dressed in the robes of justice. A time when the elders proclaimed their authority by choosing one among them to bear the weight of their sins. That night the fire burned brighter. That night the drums sounded more like war than warning. And that night they chose her. What? No one could say for sure. Perhaps they feared her too much to let her live unbound. Or maybe they needed to prove to themselves that they still had power over the past. They bound her wrists. They carved symbols into the earth. They chanted. And as the flames licked the edge of the ceremonial pit, a wheel knelt in silence. Until she opened her mouth. It wasn't a cry. It wasn't a scream. It was a voice, clear, ancient, and filled with fury. A voice that didn't sound like it belonged to one girl but to many. Generations. Echoes of the forgotten. And what she said would shake the pillars of their world. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. This is a tale of silence weaponized. Of a curse born not from magic but from fear. It is the story of how a village tried to bury its truth by caging a girl, only to find that truth, when denied, does not disappear. It grows teeth. It grows wings. And when the time is right, it returns. So before we walk into the shadows with a wheel, before we uncover the past and confront the future, ask yourself this. What would you do if the person you silenced turned out to be the only one who could save you? Or destroy you? Welcome to the tale of the girl who could not speak, until the night her voice came back with a prophecy drenched in death. If stories like these send a chill down your spine and a fire into your heart, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Share this tale with those who still believe that silence is safety, and words are harmless. Because tonight a wheel speaks, and nothing will ever be the same again. They named her Adise, daughter of kings, though her life was anything but royal. She was born under a blood moon, the sky awash in crimson as if the heavens themselves bled to herald her arrival. Her mother screamed not just from the pain of birth, but from the fear in the midwife's eyes. No child had been born on a night like that in generations. It was a bad omen, they said, a sign that something unnatural had come into the world. And unnatural she was. From her first year, Adise was unlike any other child in the village. She did not babble nonsense like the others. When she spoke, her words came slow and deliberate, as though she was not learning to speak but remembering how. By the time she was 3, she could look a person in the eye and say things no child should know. You took more yams than your share, she once whispered to a man who had just returned from the harvest. Your wife is not who you think she is, she said to a chief, days before the man's home erupted in scandal. She will not wake tomorrow, she murmured as a grandmother tucked her own sister into bed. And sure enough, by dawn that bed was cold. At first they called it cleverness. They said the child had a sharp mind, or perhaps that the spirits simply favored her. But the older she got and the deeper her words cut, the less the village admired her. Elders began to look at her with suspicion. Mothers pulled their children away when she walked past. Even her own family grew uneasy, whispering to one another in the night, as though she were a storm that might hear them coming. She speaks what is not meant to be spoken, said one elder. She knows things that even the gods have not yet revealed, muttered another. And so it was decided, quietly without vote or voice, that something had to be done. Not for her sake but for theirs. They told themselves it was kindness, protection, tradition. But deep down they feared her. Deep down they believed that if they did not silence her, she would unmake everything they had built with just her words. The ritual took place on the 7th year of her life. They brought her to the river under the cover of night, where the moon glinted silver upon the water. The elders chanted in low, anxious tones. A fetish priest daubed white chalk on her forehead. Her mother wept silently at the edge of the gathering but did not stop them. Adise did not struggle. She stood still, her wide, curious eyes fixed on the stars above. And when they finished the incantation, when the final words were whispered into the wind, something shifted. The world seemed to hold its breath. The night birds fell quiet. Even the river stopped its murmuring. From that moment on, no sound came from her lips. Not laughter. Not breath. Not even a cry. She opened her mouth to speak, to ask, to plead, but it was as if the wind itself had stolen her voice and buried it somewhere far beyond reach. And though the people rejoiced, claiming peace had been restored, they never looked her in the eye again. She grew in silence and the silence grew with her. But Adise was not broken. Not entirely. She began to speak in other ways. Her eyes grew sharp, always watching, always remembering. Her hands, once small and clumsy, became nimble and sure, weaving symbols in the dirt, painting signs onto clay, leaving warnings etched into stone. Children were told not to go near her. Men crossed to the other side of the road when she approached. Even the dogs kept their distance. She became a ghost in the land of the living, cursed not only by the silence forced upon her, but by the truths still burning within. Her eyes, bright and haunted, followed everyone who wronged her. And she remembered, oh how she remembered, every lie, every secret, every sin they had buried beneath rituals and prayers. Adise never wept in public. But the forest heard her breathless sobs. The river knew her anger. And the wind? The wind carried her sorrow like song. And still she listened. Listened as lovers quarreled behind huts. Listened as priests lied in the name of gods. Listened as elders plotted how to keep her buried in fear and silence. They had stolen her voice, but given her something far more dangerous in return, clarity. By the time she reached womanhood, she was a thing of legend. Mothers told their daughters, do not look her in the eyes, lest you dream of your own death. Warriors touched charms when her shadow passed. Even the high priest refused to speak her name aloud. But Adise did not seek vengeance. Not then. She waited. Waited for the night when the truth would demand its reckoning. Waited for the moment when prophecy, like her voice, would return. The people had forgotten that silence is not the absence of sound, it is the space where echoes build. And Adise, the girl cursed under a blood moon, had become the keeper of every echo they tried to silence. Her curse was not her silence. It was their ignorance. And soon they would learn that some truths do not die. They simply bide their time. Adise became a shadow not by choice but by force. After the ritual that sealed her voice, she returned home not as a child but as a presence. A presence that unsettled the air around her. Her mother avoided her gaze, her brothers refused to sit near her during meals, and even her father, once proud of her cleverness, looked through her as if she were a fog that never lifted. In the village, her silence became louder than any scream. Children ran when they saw her coming. Some would throw small stones, others whispered behind her back, calling her Adise the mute, or worse, Adise the cursed. It didn't matter that she never harmed anyone. Fear had already twisted her image in their minds. In their eyes she was no longer a girl but a warning. Yet in her silence, Adise learned new languages. Her fingers became storytellers, drawing symbols in the dirt, painting with ash, arranging stones into messages that only those willing to understand could interpret. She crafted her own way of speaking, not with words but with meaning. A woven strand of red around a tree root meant protection. A circle of ground pepper around a threshold meant danger. A carved wooden eye left at the door of a sick child meant healing was near. But most never knew where these signs came from. They never saw the small hands in the dark, the quick feet that moved between huts like wind. They only found results. Sickness eased, nightmares vanished, crops that once failed now showed green. Some called it coincidence. Others magic. But none dared admit it might be Adise. Even those who benefited from her secret help never thanked her. Gratitude, after all, would mean acknowledging her presence. And that would mean admitting that they had been wrong. Still, she never stopped giving. Every time someone crossed a sacred boundary, she left markings to guide them back. When a young girl wept silently by the river, Adise placed a small clay figure beside her, an old village token of comfort, long forgotten by most. When a woman miscarried and blamed herself, she found a healing bundle wrapped in banana leaves beneath her bed, filled with herbs that only the old healers remembered. And yet, the whispers never stopped. Since she lost her voice, the rains have failed. My cow died the day after she passed my gate. Adise looked at me too long and my son fell sick the next week. It was easier to blame her than to face uncertainty. Fear needed a face and Adise's silent one made the perfect vessel. But while the world painted her as a curse, she dreamed. At night, she was no longer bound by silence. In her dreams, she spoke with the clarity of water, the strength of thunder, the rage of fire. She saw herself standing atop the village hill, her voice echoing like the voice of the gods. People fell to their knees, not in fear but in awe. She spoke and the sky wept or laughed. She spoke and trees grew or withered. She spoke and truth unfurled like the pages of a forgotten scroll. Sometimes the ancestors came to her. They did not speak in words but in images, visions carved into smoke and stars. One dream showed a tree burning with blue fire, its roots coiled around bones. Another showed the village drowning in silence, only to be saved by a single voice. In every dream she stood at the center. In every dream the prophecy waited. What it was she could not say. But it pulsed beneath her skin, like a drum waiting for the right rhythm. Her silence was no longer just a punishment, it was a barrier. One that held back not just truth but power. As she aged into a young woman, her strength grew. So did the strangeness around her. Animals gathered where she slept, owls, lizards, even a black panther once watched from a distance before disappearing into the trees. The winds seemed to follow her movements. And her drawings, once simple messages, began to shift. She'd draw something at dawn, a coiled serpent, a falling star, a crying child, and by dusk those things would come to pass. She stopped trying to explain it. No one would listen anyway. Still she watched. Still she waited. Because she knew, deep in the marrow of her bones, that her voice had not been taken. It had been buried. And like all things buried, it would rise, when the time was right. Each time the villagers shunned her, she grew more certain. Each time she left healing herbs and they refused to thank her, the fire inside her blazed brighter. Each time she stared at the sky and felt the spirits watching, the prophecy hummed louder in her chest. The village thought they had silenced her. But they had only delayed the storm. And storms do not forget where they are born. Adise, the girl with fire in her eyes and silence on her lips, was not cursed. She was becoming. Adise had always known that her silence made her a target. But nothing could have prepared her for the weight of accusation that fell upon her the day the nobleman's son died. It was a bright afternoon, the sun casting long shadows over the village. Adise had been returning from the forest, her hands full of herbs for a sick child, when the news reached her ears. A messenger, breathless and frantic, arrived at her doorstep, his eyes wide with panic. "It's the boy. The son of Chief Ogbu's brother. He's dead," he shouted, his voice trembling. She stood still, feeling the familiar prickling of anxiety on the back of her neck. She had heard whispers before of how the villagers blamed her for things beyond her control. Strange illnesses, bad harvests, even the deaths of animals. She was always at the center of the accusations, though she knew none of it was her fault. But this death, this was different. The son of the nobleman was a fine young man, one who had been favored by the village. His family was powerful, respected, and well-connected. His death, sudden and unexplained, shook the village to its core. Within hours, the rumor began to spread like wildfire. Adise, the mute girl who walked with the shadows, was responsible for the boy's untimely demise. The evidence? None. The logic? None. But that mattered little. Fear is a powerful thing, and when it gathers in the heart of a community, It consumes all reason. By evening, the village had gathered in the central square. The chief, his face grave, stood before the crowd. His voice carried with authority, his words steeped in the ancient customs of their people. "Adis," he began, his voice cold, "your silence speaks louder than any words. We have watched you, always on the edges of our lives, bringing with you misfortune, disease, and death. And now, our most beloved son has died. There can be no more doubt. You are the one responsible." Adis' heart hammered in her chest, but she stood still, her gaze unwavering. She had long learned the ways of the village, the ways of the people who turned their backs on her, who refused to see her for who she truly was. She had been abandoned to the shadows, and now the darkness had come for her once more. The crowd murmured, their voices rising in a chorus of fear and anger. Some shouted for her to be punished. Others demanded that she be executed. But the chief remained unmoved. "The gods demand a punishment," the chief declared. "A punishment that will cleanse this village of the evil that you have brought." Adis was led to the sacred Irako tree at the edge of the village, where the spirits of the ancestors were said to reside. The tree was a place of both worship and fear, its roots deep in the earth, its branches reaching toward the sky like hands grasping for something far beyond mortal reach. The villagers tied her to the tree, her wrists bound with thick ropes. She was left alone, under the watchful eyes of the gods, to face whatever fate they would bring. The wind began to howl as night descended, and the air grew thick with anticipation. Adis closed her eyes, her body trembling not from fear, but from something else. She could feel the earth beneath her, feel the pulse of the ancient spirits that had always watched over the land. She felt them stir as if waking from a long slumber, and deep within her, something began to awaken as well. The first thunderclap shattered the night, so loud it shook the very ground beneath her. The villagers scattered, retreating to their homes, afraid of the storm that had suddenly appeared without warning. The air grew heavy, the winds rising to a deafening roar. Trees bent under the pressure, their branches snapping in the fierce gusts. And through it all, Adis remained still, her body held tight to the sacred tree, her eyes closed as she listened to the storm around her. But then a new sound emerged, an eerie whisper, like the rustling of ancient leaves in a forgotten forest. It was a voice but not her own. It came from deep within the earth, carried on the wind, and Adis could feel it course through her very bones. The ancestors were speaking. They spoke of betrayal. They spoke of injustice. They spoke of silence and of truth buried beneath it. Adis had been wronged, but her silence would no longer be her prison. The storm had come to break the chains, to unleash the power that had been sealed away for too long. As the thunder rumbled again, the wind picked up once more, howling with fury. The ground beneath Adis began to tremble, and the sacred Irako tree seemed to shake with life. The ropes binding her arms snapped, as though the spirits themselves were releasing her from her torment. In that moment, Adis' mouth opened, and a sound that had not passed her lips in years filled the air, a voice rich and powerful, carrying the weight of all the things she had been forbidden to speak. The prophecy poured from her like a river breaking through a dam, unstoppable, uncontainable. "The blood of the innocent will not go unpunished," she declared, her voice echoing across the village. "The cursed will rise and the truth will burn like fire." The storm intensified, the winds howling louder, the thunder crashing like the sound of 1,000 drums. The villagers who had gathered in fear now trembled before her, knowing that something far greater than themselves was at work. Adis' voice was no longer just her own. It was the voice of the ancestors, the voice of the earth itself. And in that voice, they heard the weight of centuries of pain, the anger of those who had been silenced, and the justice that would come for those who had wronged her. As the storm reached its peak, Adis raised her arms, and the wind seemed to answer her call. Lightning struck the Irako tree, splitting it in two, the sound of the thunder deafening. The storm did not end with the destruction of the tree. No, it was only the beginning. Adis had been silenced for too long, but now she was speaking and the world would listen. And with her words, the villagers learned the true cost of their fear, their silence, and their cruelty. The punishment they had given her was not the end, it was only the beginning of something far greater. The storm that raged around Adis was no longer just a tempest, it had become a force of nature, an extension of her fury, her vengeance, and the power of the ancestors that had long been dormant within her. The wind screamed through the village, tearing at the rooftops, ripping through the fields, and shaking the earth beneath her feet. It was as if the very gods themselves were listening, responding to the call of her voice. For years, Adis had been silent, her mouth sealed by the curse that had been placed upon her. But now, as the storm reached its peak, her voice broke free. It was not a whisper nor a murmur, but a deafening scream that echoed across the land, a sound that carried with it not only the weight of her own suffering, but the collective pain of every spirit who had ever been wronged, silenced, or erased. Her scream split the air, reverberating through the village and beyond. It was a cry that seemed to come from the very earth itself, as though the land itself was releasing its anguish. The villagers, already trembling in fear, froze at the sound, their hearts pounding in their chests. No one had heard a scream like that before, so powerful, so raw, so filled with a rage that could only come from the very depths of the soul. But it was not just Adi's voice that they heard. No, it was the voices of the dead, the spirits of those who had been wronged, those who had been silenced by fear and injustice. Their voices layered over hers, a chorus of condemnation, each one echoing through the storm, each one adding weight to the prophecy that Adis had spoken. "The blood you spill will drown you," Adis shouted, her voice rising above the roar of the wind. "Your secrets will burn. Your lineage will end by dawn." As the words left her lips, the very air seemed to tremble. The storm intensified, the thunder crackling like the roar of 1,000 wild beasts. The earth beneath Adis' feet seemed to shake as if responding to her words, and the wind howled with an unearthly fury. Lightning struck down from the heavens, illuminating the sky in flashes of white-hot brilliance. The villagers who had once called her cursed, who had condemned her to silence, now stood paralyzed by fear. The once peaceful village was now a place of chaos and terror, as the storm tore through it like a wild animal. The sacred Irako tree that had once stood as a symbol of their gods and ancestors now quivered, its roots pulled from the earth, its trunk splitting in two with a deafening crack. The villagers screamed in terror as the ancient tree fell, its massive branches crashing to the ground. They knew that something had changed, something far greater than their understanding. Adis, the girl they had silenced, had become something else entirely, something they could not control, something they could not even comprehend. In the midst of the chaos, Adis stood tall, her arms raised toward the sky as the storm raged around her. Her voice was no longer just her own, it was the voice of the ancestors, the voice of the earth, the voice of every wrong that had ever been committed. And with each word, with each prophecy, she grew stronger, the power of the spirits flowing through her like an unstoppable river. The villagers, once so sure of their power, now realized how small they were in the face of something far older and more powerful. They had sought to silence her, to bury her truth, but in doing so, they had awakened something far more dangerous. As the storm continued to rage, the villagers scattered in all directions, fleeing from the wrath they had brought upon themselves. But it was too late. The prophecy had been spoken, and the curse was set in motion. Adis' voice would not be silenced again. The storm had come to cleanse the land, to purge the sins of those who had wronged her, and to restore the balance that had been disrupted by their cruelty. The sacred Irako tree, the symbol of their gods, had been torn asunder. The village, once a place of peace and unity, was now in ruins, the people scattered like ants before the storm. But Adis stood unmoving, her gaze fixed on the horizon, her voice carrying over the wind, a beacon of truth in the darkness. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the storm began to fade. The wind died down, the lightning ceased, and the thunder rumbled away into the distance. But the damage had already been done. The village would never be the same again. Adis, her voice still ringing in the air, stood alone among the wreckage. The villagers who had once condemned her, who had silenced her for so long, were gone. They had fled, leaving only the echoes of their fear behind. And Adis knew that she had fulfilled her prophecy. The blood that had been spilled would indeed drown them. The secrets they had kept would burn them. And their lineage, the line that had once held power over the village, would end before the dawn. Adis was no longer the cursed girl, the mute child condemned to silence. She had become something far greater. She had become the voice of truth, the force of justice, and the embodiment of the wrath of the ancestors. She had broken free from her chains, and now she would ensure that no one else would ever be silenced again. And as the first rays of dawn began to break over the horizon, Adis turned and walked away from the village that had once been her home. The storm was over, but her voice, the voice of the ancestors, would echo in the winds for generations to come. As dawn broke, the village that had once stood proud and serene now lay in ruin. The storm had passed, but the terror lingered, hanging in the air like a suffocating cloud. What Adis had foretold was now beginning to come true. The prophecy she had spoken, the words that had echoed through the night, were unfolding with terrifying precision. The first sign came at the village's heart, where the central market once thrived and the homes stood tall. Now there was only devastation. Flames flickered on the horizon, consuming the homes of the elders who had once been so certain of their power. The houses they had built with their own hands, the structures that symbolized their authority over the village, were now reduced to ash, swallowed by the flames as though the earth itself was purging them. Next, the wells, the lifeblood of the village, dried up. No matter how deep the villagers dug, no water would come. The earth beneath them seemed to reject them, to withhold the very thing they depended on to survive. It was as if the land itself had turned its back on them, listening to Adi's prophecy and refusing to nourish the people who had wronged her. Cattle, once the pride of the village's wealth, fell ill and died overnight. Their bodies lay in the fields, bloated and lifeless. No one could explain it. Some whispered that it was the curse that Adis had spoken, that the blood they had spilled in their cruelty had come back to haunt them. Others feared that the very spirits they had tried to silence were now taking their revenge. But the most chilling of all the events that began to unfold that night was the deaths of the elders. The men and women who had once held the village's power, the ones who had orchestrated Adis' punishment, began to perish in the strangest of ways. One elder was struck down by a bolt of lightning while praying for mercy. Another collapsed as if gripped by an invisible force, his breath stolen from him as he choked on nothing. A third fell into a pit of fire that seemed to rise up from the ground itself, though no flames had been seen before. It was clear now, the prophecy Adis had spoken was not just empty words. The curses were not of her doing, but the result of the blood that had been spilled, the injustice that had been carried out in the name of fear. The villagers had ignored the warning signs, had tried to bury the truth for too long, and now they were paying the price. As chaos reigned and fear spread throughout the village, a discovery was made that would change everything. In the chief's home, hidden away in a dusty corner of the grand house, a scroll was uncovered. It was old, yellowed with age, and sealed with wax that had been broken only moments before. The scroll was carefully unrolled, revealing a message that had been hidden for years. Its contents were a revelation to all who saw it. The words, written in the ancient script of the elders, revealed the truth. Adis was not cursed. She was a seer, a child blessed by the ancestors with the ability to see beyond the veil of life and death. The scroll confirmed what the elders had known for years, that Adis was no mere girl, but a channel for the spirits, a conduit for the wisdom and wrath of the ancestors themselves. The chief and the elders had known this all along, but they had chosen to ignore it. They had feared Adis' power, her ability to see what they could not. In their arrogance and greed, they had decided to silence her, to punish her for revealing truths they were not ready to face. They had performed the ritual to steal her voice, to ensure that her power would never be used against them. But in their fear they had made a grave mistake. They had thought that silencing Adis would protect them. Instead, it had set in motion a chain of events that they could not control. The power of the ancestors, once locked away in the silence of the girl, had been unleashed. The curse, as it turned out, was not real. It had been a construct of their own making, a product of their fear of the unknown. They had tried to bury the truth, to keep it hidden behind the veil of silence. But truth, like the winds and the storms, could not be controlled. The village now stood on the edge of ruin. The elders who had led the charge against Adis were all dead, their bodies lying in strange and unnatural ways. The people, once so certain of their power, now cowered in fear, uncertain of what would come next. Adis' prophecy had been clear: the blood they spilled would drown them. Their secrets would burn, and their lineage would end by dawn. The villagers, now desperate and broken, gathered in the remains of their homes, searching for answers. They turned to the scroll, which had been passed down through the generations, but the truth it contained was undeniable. The power that Adis had been given was not a curse, it was a blessing, one that had been ignored and twisted by those who feared it. As the sun began to rise, casting its pale light over the village, the people were left to face the consequences of their actions. The storm had passed, but the damage had been done. Adis had spoken the prophecy, and the villagers had ignored the warning. Now they would pay the price for their arrogance, their fear, and their silence. The hidden scroll in the chief's home, the revelation of the truth, was the final piece of the puzzle. The curse was not the power that Adis possessed, but the fear of it. The villagers had been afraid of what they didn't understand, and in their fear, they had destroyed everything they had worked for. In the end, Adis' voice had returned not to destroy them, but to set them free. The prophecy had unfolded as it was meant to, revealing the truth that could not be ignored. The curse was broken, but it was not the curse of the seer, it was the curse of those who sought to silence the truth. The people now understood that it was not Adis who was cursed, but those who had tried to bury her voice. In the wake of the devastation that had swept through the village, a heavy silence descended upon the survivors. Those who remained, shaken and broken, began to gather in the ruins of their homes. The fires had burned through the night, the winds had screamed and the storms had passed, but the destruction remained. The elders who had once ruled the village were gone, their bodies found in ways that no natural explanation could account for. The people, now left with nothing but their guilt and their fear, turned their desperate eyes to Adise. For the first time in their lives, they truly understood the power she possessed. Not just the power of the ancestors, not just the power of the spoken prophecy, but the power of truth itself. In their blindness and arrogance, they had tried to bury her, to silence her, to erase her from the fabric of their existence. And yet, despite all their efforts, the truth had found its way back into the world, unshakable, unyielding, and unstoppable. The villagers, now broken and humbled, approached Adise. Their eyes were filled with fear, shame, and a deep, pleading need for redemption. They had destroyed so much, so many lives had been lost, both literally and metaphorically. The survivors could hardly look each other in the eye, let alone face the woman they had condemned to silence. She had been their scapegoat, their enemy, their outcast. And now, in the aftermath of their own undoing, they knew that she was the only one who could offer them any semblance of peace. "Please," they begged, their voices trembling with remorse, "forgive us. We were wrong. We were blinded by fear and power. Please, forgive us, Adise." The woman who stood before them was no longer the meek, voiceless girl they had once condemned. She was transformed, not just by the events of the past few days, but by the voice that had returned, carrying with it the weight of the prophecy and the judgment of the ancestors. Her eyes, once so filled with the sorrow of silence, now burned with an ancient wisdom. She had suffered at their hands, endured unimaginable cruelty, and yet she stood before them not in anger but in the stillness of truth. For a long moment Adise said nothing. She simply stared at the villagers, her gaze sweeping over their faces, those who had once called her cursed, those who had turned away from her, those who had silenced her for their own comfort. Now they were asking for her forgiveness, but could it be so easily given? Could the years of suffering she had endured be undone with a few words? The wind picked up again, rustling the trees around the village as though the earth itself was holding its breath. And then, in the stillness of that moment, Adise spoke, not in anger, not in bitterness, but in the clarity of a voice that had been buried for far too long. "Truth cannot be buried, and neither can I," she said softly, her words carrying with them a finality that seemed to reverberate through the very air. It was as though the world paused at her words. The villagers, already trembling with fear, stood frozen in place, unable to comprehend the depth of what they were hearing. This was no mere forgiveness, no easy reconciliation. This was a declaration of truth, a truth that could not be hidden, no matter how deep the grave they tried to dig for it. Adise turned away from them, her gaze lifting to the horizon. The village, which had once been filled with life and noise, was now silent, so silent that the only sound that could be heard was the soft rustling of the wind through the trees. The storms had passed, but their echoes lingered. The skies had cleared, but the weight of the events that had unfolded still hung heavily in the air. The villagers understood, perhaps for the first time in their lives, that they had not been the ones in control. They had not been the ones who had decided their fate. It had been Adise, the girl they had tried to silence, who had turned their world upside down. And now she was walking away. Without a word, she stepped into the forest, disappearing into the shadows of the trees. The villagers watched her go, but no one dared to follow. The winds howled, almost as if calling her name, as though the earth itself recognized the power she wielded. Adise had spoken her truth, and now she was leaving. Her journey had not been one of vengeance, nor of forgiveness, but of truth. A truth that could not be hidden, no matter how hard they tried to bury it. The village, now devoid of its former leaders, was left to grapple with the consequences of their actions. The once thriving community was silent, no longer filled with the sound of children laughing, the chatter of neighbors, or the bustle of life. The elders were gone, their voices silenced by their own cruelty. And Adise, the girl they had tried to erase, had disappeared into the forest, leaving behind only her words, and the weight of the prophecy she had spoken. From that day forward, the village was never the same. It was a place of reverence and fear, haunted by the memory of what had been and what could never be undone. The villagers, once so certain of their power, were left to face the truth they had tried so hard to bury. The silence that had once surrounded Adise now hung over them, suffocating them with its weight. And Adise, the girl who had been cursed to never speak, had spoken the truth. A truth that could not be erased. A truth that would echo in the winds for generations to come. The legacy of Adiz, the girl who could not be silenced, would live on, whispered in the wind, carried in the rustling of the leaves, and etched into the very earth beneath the villagers' feet. The prophecy had come to pass, and the village would never forget the price of silencing the truth. As for Adiz, she walked deeper into the forest, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The world would know her name not as the girl who had been silenced, but as the woman who had given voice to the truth, and in doing so, had changed everything. The years passed, and the village gradually began to rebuild itself, though its scars would never fade. The elders who once ruled with unquestioned authority were gone, victims of their own actions, the price they paid for trying to suppress what they could not understand. Adiz, the girl who had been cursed into silence, had become a figure not of fear but of reverence. Her prophecy had reshaped the very soul of the village, and her story, though tragic, had become a cornerstone of its identity. In the heart of the village, a shrine was erected in her honor. But this shrine was unlike any other. There were no statues, no grand carvings, no elaborate symbols. Instead, it was simple, a mirror and an open book. The mirror, smooth and unblemished, reflected the faces of those who stood before it, reminding them that truth was a reflection of themselves, and that each person was responsible for their own actions. The open book was left blank, for it symbolized the unwritten future, the endless possibilities that lay ahead, if only they chose to listen, to speak the truth, and to live with honor. The shrine became a place of pilgrimage, especially for the young. Children, particularly girls, were taught the story of Adiz. Her name was no longer spoken with fear or pity, but with pride. She had been a symbol of resilience, of standing firm in the face of oppression, of finding strength even when the world tried to silence you. Her life, though filled with suffering, had shown the villagers the power of truth, the power of speaking when you had been told to remain silent. For generations, Adiz's legacy lived on in the children who came to the shrine, their faces full of wonder as they learned of the girl who had once been cursed to never speak. They learned how she had suffered, how she had been cast out, and how, despite all that, she had never lost her voice. They were taught that no one could silence the truth, not even the most powerful of elders, not even the most fearsome of storms. Adiz had shown them that truth had its own way of making itself known, no matter the cost. As the years went by, the village flourished. No longer did the people live in fear of speaking out, of asking questions, of seeking justice. The silence that had once suffocated them was replaced by a new kind of freedom, a freedom born from the lessons learned through Adiz's suffering. No one was ever silenced again. The villagers had learned, the hard way, that the truth would always find a way to be heard. On stormy nights, when the winds howled and the trees creaked under the force of the storm, the villagers would gather around the fire, telling stories and whispering legends. It was said that if you listened closely, you could hear Adiz's voice riding the wind. Some claimed it was a warning to those who lied or oppressed. Others believed it was a call to remember the lessons of the past. Whatever the truth was, the villagers knew that Adiz's voice had never truly left them. It was in the wind, in the storm, in the rustling of the leaves, a constant reminder that the truth could never be silenced. Her voice, now immortalized in the winds, was a warning to all who would seek to oppress others, to those who would try to bury the truth. She had given her life to ensure that no one would ever have to endure the silence she had faced. Her legacy was not just one of survival but of empowerment, a call for justice, for truth, and for freedom. In the years to come, her story would be told again and again, passed down through the generations. Parents would tell their children of the girl who had been silenced, but who had spoken the truth that changed everything. And in telling her story, they would ensure that no one would ever forget the lessons she had taught them. That truth, no matter how hard it is to bear, must always be spoken, and that silence is never the answer. Adiz had become more than a name, more than a memory. She had become a symbol of the power of the voiceless, of the strength that comes from standing firm in your truth, no matter the cost. And as long as the village remembered her story, her legacy would live on. The mirror at the shrine reflected the faces of those who came to pay their respects, reminding them that the truth was always present, always watching, always waiting to be spoken. The open book remained empty, a blank page that invited those who came to write their own story, one that would be rooted in honesty, in justice, and in the courage to stand up for what was right. The legacy of Adiz, the voiceless prophet, was not one of bitterness or vengeance. It was one of hope, a hope that the future could be different, that silence could be broken, and that truth, no matter how long it takes, would always find a way to rise. And as the storm clouds gathered on the horizon, the villagers knew that Adiz's voice would always be there, carried on the wind, warning those who would lie, those who would oppress, and those who would try to bury the truth. Her legacy was unbreakable, her voice eternal. The story of Adiz is a powerful reminder of how fear can silence the truth, and how power, when unchecked, can corrupt even the most just of societies. The villagers feared what they did not understand. They saw her gifts as a curse, her wisdom as a threat, and her silence as a punishment. In their desperation, they tried to bury her voice, to suppress the very truth she carried. But in doing so, they sealed their own fate, for truth is a force that cannot be so easily contained. Fear has always been a tool used by those in power to maintain control. By silencing Adiz, the elders believed they were protecting their position, their authority, their way of life. But what they failed to realize was that silencing the truth only makes it louder, more insistent, more powerful. The fire that they set to burn her voice only served to fuel the flames of the prophecy she would one day speak. Truth, like fire, cannot be extinguished by fear, by violence, or by silence. It will find a way to break free, to reveal itself in the most unexpected ways. When Adiz's voice returned, it wasn't just her own voice, it was the voice of the ancestors, of generations who had been silenced, of the earth itself crying out for justice. Her voice carried the weight of everything that had been hidden, everything that had been ignored, everything that had been buried under the veil of silence. And when that voice spoke, it shook the very foundation of the village. The prophecy was not just a warning, it was a reckoning. The blood they had spilled, the secrets they had kept, the lies they had told, all of it came rushing back in a wave of destruction that they could no longer escape. But the true power of Adiz's story lies not in the destruction that followed her prophecy, but in the resilience she showed in the face of her curse. Though she had been silenced, though she had been bound by the very people who should have protected her, she never lost her power. She learned to communicate in ways that transcended language, to speak through her actions, through her wisdom, through the way she cared for the land and the people around her. Her silence was not a sign of weakness, it was a form of resistance, a refusal to be controlled by those who sought to oppress her. And when her voice returned, it was not out of vengeance but out of necessity, because the truth needed to be heard. Her journey teaches us that silence is not always a sign of submission or weakness. Sometimes silence is a form of strength. It is the quiet before the storm, the patience before the inevitable reckoning. Adiz's silence was a powerful act of defiance, an unspoken protest against the injustice she had suffered. And when she spoke, she did not speak for herself alone. She spoke for all those who had been silenced, for all those who had been oppressed, for all those who had been forced to hide their truth in the shadows. The truth, when it returns, demands to be heard. It does not apologize for the pain it causes, nor does it wait for permission to be spoken. The truth is a force that cannot be denied, a force that will continue to rise no matter how many times it is buried. Adiz's voice was a reminder that the truth, once unleashed, has the power to change everything. It can topple empires, break the silence of generations, and bring even the most powerful to their knees. But truth is not always easy. It is not always convenient. It can be uncomfortable, it can be painful, and it can cost us everything. Adiz knew this. She knew that speaking the truth would come with a price, that it would bring her suffering, that it would bring her pain, that it would bring her enemies. But she also knew that not speaking it would be worse. To remain silent would mean letting the lies and the corruption continue unchecked, would mean allowing the injustice to persist. So she chose to speak even when it seemed impossible. She chose to shout when it mattered most. This raises a question that we must all face. If you were cursed for speaking truth, would you stay silent to survive, or would you shout when it mattered most? Would you allow fear to silence you, to keep you from speaking out against what is wrong? Or would you find the courage to speak even when it costs you everything? Adiz's story is one of defiance, of courage, of standing up for what is right, even in the face of overwhelming odds. It challenges us to reflect on our own lives, on the times we have remained silent when we should have spoken, on the times we have allowed fear to control us. The moral of Adiz's tale is clear. Silence, when forced upon us, is not a sign of weakness, but a form of resistance. It is a powerful tool that can carry the weight of truth, waiting for the right moment to be unleashed. And when that moment comes, the truth will always find its voice. It will speak for those who have been silenced, for those who have been forgotten, for those who have been oppressed. And when it does, it will demand justice. Adiz's story is a call to action. It is a reminder that we must never allow fear to silence us, that we must never allow those in power to suppress our voices. It is a reminder that the truth, no matter how painful or uncomfortable, must always be spoken. And it is a reminder that we all have a role to play in ensuring that the voices of the oppressed are heard, that the truths of the past are acknowledged and that justice is served. As we reflect on Adi's story, we must ask ourselves, are we ready to speak the truth, even when it is difficult? Are we ready to stand up for what is right, even when it feels impossible? Are we ready to break the silence and let the truth be heard? The story of Adiz is a powerful lesson in resilience, courage, and the enduring power of truth. It is a story that will echo through the ages, a story that will continue to inspire those who are willing to stand up, speak out, and fight for what is right. And as we listen to her story, let us remember that we, too, have the power to break the silence, to speak the truth, and to make a difference in the world. If you have been inspired by Adiz's story, be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more haunting ancestral African tales. Let her voice live on in you, and let her legacy be a reminder that the truth will always find a way to be heard.